The day I found Karen standing on my front porch with a clipboard and a smile that could freeze lava, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to go straight to hell. "Good morning," she chirped, her voice carrying that particular pitch that only middle-aged women who want something use. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I noticed you haven't been attending our monthly meetings or paying your dues. We need to discuss your compliance issues immediately." I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and looked at this woman like she'd just spoken Mandarin. "I'm sorry, what? I don't belong to any HOA." Patricia's smile tightened, and she clutched her clipboard harder against her powder blue blazer. "Mr. Ashford Xavier, correct? Living at 4782 Pinewood Drive. That's me. Then yes, you absolutely are part of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Every property in this subdivision is required to be a member. You're currently 3 months behind on dues, which totals $600, plus a late fee of $200. She tapped her pen against the clipboard with each word like she was hammering nails into my coffin. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation hit me all at once. "Lady, I hate to break it to you, but I'm not part of your little club. I never signed anything agreeing to join an HOA, and I'm definitely not paying you $800. Her face went from pleasant pink to an angry red that clashed terribly with her blazer. "This is not optional, Mr. Xavier. When you purchased this property, you automatically became subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I have the paperwork right here." She flipped through her clipboard and produced a document that looked official enough. It was a list of properties in what she called Meadowbrook Estates, and sure enough, my address was on there. But I'd done my homework when I bought this place 6 months ago. I'd specifically looked for property without HOA entanglements because I'd heard enough horror stories to last a lifetime. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I bought this land and built this house myself. There was no HOA mentioned in any of my closing documents." "Then you clearly didn't read your paperwork carefully enough," Patricia snapped. "I'll expect payment within 7 days, or we'll be forced to place a lien on your property. Additionally, your fence is 3 inches too tall according to our guidelines. Your mailbox is the wrong color, and you've been parking your truck in your driveway instead of your garage, which is strictly prohibited." Now I was getting angry. My truck, in my driveway, on my property. "You've got to be kidding me. The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Xavier. They maintain property values and ensure our neighborhood remains attractive and desirable. I suggest you familiarize yourself with them immediately." She pulled out a thick binder from her bag and tried to hand it to me. I didn't take it. "I'm not reading that because I'm not in your HOA. I don't know how else to say this." "Denial won't change the facts," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I've been doing this for 12 years. I know every property in Meadowbrook Estates. You can't just opt out because you don't feel like following the rules." Something about her absolute certainty made me pause. This woman genuinely believed what she was saying. Either she was delusional, or there was something more going on here. I decided to dig deeper. "Tell me something," I said. "When was Meadowbrook Estates HOA established?" Patricia puffed up with pride. 15 years ago. I was one of the founding members. We established it to protect our investments when the developer started selling lots in this area." "And what developer was that?" "Riverside Properties LLC. They subdivided the original farmland and created our beautiful community." I felt a smile creeping across my face, but I suppressed it. "And how many properties are in your HOA?" 47 homes, including yours." "I see. And you have documentation showing that my specific parcel was part of the original subdivision?" "Of course I do. It's all on file at the county recorder's office. Patricia's smugness was radiating off her in waves now. Great, I said. Then you won't mind if I do some checking of my own at the county office. If I'm wrong, I'll gladly pay the dues and fix whatever violations you've cited. But if I'm right and I'm not part of your HOA, I expect you to leave me alone. Deal? Patricia's eyes narrowed. Fine. But when you discover I'm correct, which I am, I'll be expecting a formal apology in addition to the payment, and the late fees will continue to accrue daily. Sure thing, I said. I'll see you next week. She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her sensible heels clicking against the concrete. I watched her climb into a white Lexus SUV and drive off toward the cluster of houses about a quarter-mile down the road. The thing was, I already knew I was right. When I'd bought this property, I'd specifically purchased it from the Jennings family, who had owned this land for 3 generations. Old Frank Jennings had sold me 12 acres of his original farm, and I'd built my house on the portion closest to the road. The rest of it was still woods and meadow stretching back toward the creek, but I wanted to be absolutely sure before I dealt with Patricia again. So Monday morning, I took a personal day from my job at the architecture firm in downtown Richmond and headed to the county recorder's office in Henrico County, Virginia. The clerk, a friendly woman in her 60s named Dorothy, helped me pull up all the records for my property. We started with my deed, which clearly showed I'd purchased the land from Franklin Jennings Sr. The property description included the original land grant numbers going back to the 1800s. Now let me check on this HOA claim, Dorothy said, typing away at her computer. What was the name again? Meadowbrook Estates. She pulled up their records and started comparing them to my property boundaries. After about 10 minutes of cross-referencing, she looked up at me with a confused expression. This is interesting, she said. The Meadowbrook Estates subdivision is indeed registered, and it does include 47 lots. But your property isn't one of them. In fact, according to these records, your property is the original parcel that the subdivision borders. See here. She turned the monitor so I could see better. The map showed my 12 acres in green and the Meadowbrook Estates lots in blue, clustered along the eastern edge of my property line. So they're my neighbors, but I'm not part of their subdivision. Exactly. You own the parent parcel. The Meadowbrook subdivision was created from a different section of the original farm. It looks like the Jennings family sold off about 30 acres to Riverside Properties 15 years ago, but they kept your section and several others. You're completely separate. I felt vindication washing over me, but I needed more. Can I get copies of all this? The maps, the subdivision plat, my deed, everything that shows I'm not part of their HOA? Absolutely. Give me about 20 minutes. I walked out of that office with a folder full of documentation that proved beyond any doubt that Patricia Hendricks had made a massive mistake. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt uneasy. Something about this situation didn't add up. How could an HOA president of 12 years not know the actual boundaries of her own subdivision? I decided to do more digging. I drove over to the Meadowbrook Estates neighborhood and took a slow cruise through the streets. It was a typical suburban development, with cookie-cutter houses on quarter-acre lots. Nice enough, but nothing special. The houses all had similar setbacks, similar landscaping, and similar everything. Very different from my property with its old oak trees and rambling layout. As I drove, I noticed something interesting. The subdivision had 2 entrances, both on Pinewood Drive. My house was on Pinewood too, about a quarter-mile past their second entrance. The road curved after their development, and my property sat on a bend where the woods got thicker. I could see how someone might assume my property, was part of their neighborhood if they didn't look at the actual legal documents. Geographically, we were close. But legally, we were completely separate. When I got home, I found a citation taped to my front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, signed by Patricia Hendricks, fining me $200 for failure to remove trash bins from public view within 12 hours of collection. My trash bins were sitting beside my garage, exactly where I always put them. That did it. I was done being nice. I called the number on the citation and Patricia answered on the second ring. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, Patricia speaking. This is Ashford Xavier. I just found your citation on my door. Yes, Mr. Xavier. As I explained, you have multiple violations that need to be addressed immediately. I went to the county recorder's office today, I said calmly. I have documentation proving that my property was never part of Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. I'm not in your HOA and I never have been. There was a long pause. That's impossible. I have the subdivision map right here. Then your map is wrong. I have the official county records. My property is the original Jennings Farm parcel. Your subdivision was created from a different section. We're neighbors, but that's it. Let me look into this and call you back. Her voice had lost some of its certainty. Sure. But I'm telling you right now, I'm not paying any fines, any dues, or anything else to your HOA, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop putting citations on my door. I hung up before she could respond. 2 days passed quietly. I thought maybe Patricia had checked her records, realized her mistake, and would leave me alone. I should have known better. On Wednesday evening, I came home from work to find a bright orange sticker on my front window declaring my property in violation of county code. Attached to it was a notice that the HOA had filed a complaint with the county about unpermitted structures on my land. I called the county code enforcement office immediately. The officer who answered, a man named Bill Crawford, sounded tired. Yeah, we got a complaint from a Patricia Hendricks about your property. She claims you've built several structures without proper permits and that you're in violation of subdivision regulations. What structures? I asked, genuinely confused. According to the complaint, a fence, a shed, and a deck. I have permits for all of those. I pulled them 6 months ago when I built the house. Everything was inspected and approved. That's what I told Mrs. Hendricks, but she insisted I come out and verify. I can schedule an inspection for Friday if that works for you. Absolutely. And while you're here, maybe you can explain to Mrs. Hendricks that I'm not actually part of her HOA. Bill laughed. Oh, I've dealt with her before. She's called in complaints about 6 properties over the years. Very enthusiastic about enforcement. That's one word for it. Friday morning, Bill showed up right on time. He was a big guy in his 50s wearing a county uniform and carrying a clipboard. We walked around my property together while he checked everything against his records. Fence permit approved, shed permit approved, deck permit approved, he said, making notes. Everything looks good to me, Mr. Xavier. You're in full compliance. Great. Can you tell that to Patricia Hendricks? I'll send her a letter, but between you and me, I don't think it's going to stop her. She's got it in her head that your property is part of her HOA, and she doesn't like being told she's wrong. I've noticed. As if summoned by our conversation, Patricia's white Lexus pulled into my driveway. She got out carrying a briefcase this time, looking like she meant business. Officer Crawford, she said briskly. Thank you for coming. As you can see, Mr. Xavier has multiple violations that need to be addressed. Actually, Mrs. Hendricks, I've checked everything and Mr. Xavier is in full compliance with all county codes. All his structures are properly permitted. Patricia's face flushed. But the HOA regulations clearly state, Madam, Bill interrupted gently, I've looked into this, and Mr. Xavier's property isn't part of Meadowbrook Estates. He's not subject to your HOA regulations. That's ridiculous. His property is clearly within our boundaries. I'd had enough. I went inside and grabbed the folder from the county recorder's office. When I came back out, I spread the documents on the hood of Bill's truck. "This is the official subdivision plat for Meadowbrook Estates," I said, pointing to the map. "See these blue sections? That's your HOA. This green section, that's my property. We're separate." Patricia leaned over the documents, her face getting redder by the second. "This can't be right. I've been operating under the assumption that these parcels were all part of the original subdivision." "Well, your assumption was wrong," I said. "I bought this land directly from Frank Jennings. It was never subdivided. It's the original farm parcel." "But that would mean—" Patricia trailed off, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. "It means you've been harassing me for no reason. It means all your citations are invalid. And it means you need to leave me alone." Bill cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'm going to have to ask you to cease filing complaints about this property unless there's an actual county code violation. Filing false reports wastes county resources." Patricia gathered up her briefcase with shaking hands. "This isn't over. I'm going to consult with our HOA attorney." She stormed off, and Bill turned to me with a sympathetic look. "You might want to consult with an attorney too. People like her don't give up easily." He was right. The following Tuesday, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Richmond. It was from an attorney named Gregory Mills, representing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The letter claimed that despite my assertions, my property was indeed part of the HOA through something called implied covenant, and that I owed over $1,500 in back dues and fines. I took the letter to my own attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Torres who'd helped me with the property purchase. She read through it carefully, then looked up at me with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. "This is garbage," she said bluntly. "There's no implied covenant. You can't be forced into an HOA that you never agreed to join, especially when your property was never part of the subdivision in the first place. So, what do I do? Let me write a response. I'll make it very clear that they have no legal standing, and if they continue to harass you, we'll pursue legal action against them." Rachel's letter was a thing of beauty. She laid out the facts with surgical precision, cited relevant Virginia property law, and finished with a warning that any further harassment would result in a lawsuit for tortious interference and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. A week later, I discovered that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA had filed a lien against my property with the county. They claimed I owed over $2,000 in dues and fines, and they were asserting their right to collect. Rachel hit the roof when I told her. "They can't do that. They have absolutely no authority to place a lien on your property. We're filing an emergency motion to have it removed, and we're suing them." The lawsuit we filed was straightforward. We asked the court to declare that my property was not part of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, to remove the fraudulent lien, and to award damages for the harassment and legal fees I'd incurred. The HOA's response was to double down. Gregory Mills filed a counterclaim asserting that the property boundaries were unclear and that my land had been considered part of Meadowbrook Estates for 15 years. "They're lying," Rachel said when she showed me the filing. "And I can prove it." The case moved surprisingly quickly. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Henderson, scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, she ordered the lien suspended pending resolution of the case. I thought I could relax a little, but Patricia had other ideas. She started a whisper campaign in the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that I was a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. I started getting dirty looks from people I'd never met when I drove past the Meadowbrook development. Then things got weird. Someone started leaving garbage on my property line. Small stuff at first, just a bag of trash here and there. But it escalated to old furniture, broken appliances, and on one memorable morning, a toilet. I installed security cameras and caught footage of two men dumping stuff on my land in the middle of the night. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could see the truck, and it belonged to one of the Meadowbrook Estates residents. I gave the footage to the sheriff's department, and they paid a visit to the truck's owner, a guy named Dennis Porter. He claimed he'd just been helping Patricia Hendricks with community cleanup and didn't realize he was dumping on private property. The deputy who took the report told me it was a civil matter, but he did issue a warning to Dennis and Patricia that any further incidents would result in criminal charges for illegal dumping. As the court date approached, Rachel and I prepared our case. We had the property deeds, the subdivision plats, the county records, everything we needed to prove that my property had never been part of the HOA, but Rachel wanted more. "I want to understand why Patricia is so convinced your property is part of her HOA," she said. "There has to be something driving this obsession." She sent an investigator to dig into the HOA's history, and what he found was fascinating. It turned out that when Meadowbrook Estates was first established, the developer had tried to buy my parcel from Frank Jennings to expand the subdivision. Frank had refused, wanting to keep some of the original farm intact. The developer had been angry about it and had apparently told the first HOA board that the Jennings property would eventually be acquired and incorporated into the development. Patricia had been part of that original board, and she'd apparently been operating under that assumption ever since. But here's where it got interesting. About 5 years ago, there had been a dispute over the HOA's boundaries. Another property owner on the western edge of the development had challenged their inclusion in the HOA, claiming they'd never agreed to join. That owner had lost because their property had actually been part of the original subdivision, and the covenants had been properly recorded. Patricia had apparently taken that victory as confirmation that she could enforce HOA rules on any property near the development, regardless of the legal reality. "She's not just wrong," Rachel explained. "She's convinced herself she's right based on a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. She thinks proximity equals inclusion." The hearing finally arrived on a cold morning in February. The courthouse in downtown Richmond was busy, but our case was first on the docket. Rachel and I sat at one table while Patricia and Gregory Mills sat at the other. Patricia looked confident, almost smug. Judge Henderson called the case, and Rachel stood to present our side. She methodically laid out the evidence, starting with my deed and working through the subdivision history. She showed the county maps, the property records, everything. Gregory Mills tried to argue that the boundaries were ambiguous and that my property had been effectively incorporated into the HOA through years of association. Rachel demolished that argument by pointing out that there had been no association whatsoever until 6 months ago when I'd bought the property. Then Rachel played her trump card. She'd found the original marketing materials for Meadowbrook Estates from 15 years ago, and they clearly showed the subdivision boundaries, which did not include my property. In fact, the materials specifically mentioned that the development bordered the historic Jennings farm. Judge Henderson looked at Patricia over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Hendricks, did you ever actually verify that Mr. Xavier's property was legally part of your subdivision before you started assessing fines and filing liens?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "The property is on Pinewood Drive, right next to our development. It seemed obvious that it was included. Seemed obvious is not the same as legally verified, the judge said sharply. Did you check the property records? I assumed the subdivision map I had was accurate. You assumed. And based on that assumption, you filed a lien against Mr. Xavier's property for over $2,000 in dues and fines. Yes, Your Honor. I was acting in accordance with my duties as HOA president. Judge Henderson was not impressed. She ruled from the bench, declaring that my property was definitively not part of Meadowbrook Estates HOA, ordering the lien removed immediately and awarding me damages for legal fees and harassment. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Hendricks, I'm also ordering you to provide a complete list of all properties currently considered part of Meadowbrook Estates HOA, along with documentation showing that each property was legally included in the original subdivision. You have 30 days. Patricia went pale. Your Honor, I don't understand why that's necessary. Because if you've made this mistake with Mr. Xavier's property, you may have made it with others. And if you've been collecting dues and assessing fines against people who aren't actually part of your HOA, that could constitute fraud. I saw Gregory Mills lean over and whisper urgently to Patricia. Her face went from pale to gray. We left the courthouse victorious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Rachel must have felt the same way because she said, "I'm going to keep digging. Something's not right here." Over the next few weeks, Rachel's investigator did a deep dive into the Meadowbrook Estates HOA finances. What he found was shocking. It turned out that Patricia had been including 6 properties in the HOA that weren't actually part of the subdivision. My property was one of them, but there were 5 others. All of them were on the edges of the development, and all of them had been paying dues for years without realizing they weren't legally required to. That was bad enough, but it got worse. The investigator discovered that Patricia had been inflating the fines and fees she collected, pocketing the difference between what she told the HOA board and what she actually collected. Over the course of 12 years, she'd embezzled over $100,000. Rachel took all this information to the HOA board, and they were stunned. They'd trusted Patricia completely and had never audited her work. Within days, they'd fired her as president, filed a police report, and hired a forensic accountant to determine the full extent of the fraud. I was contacted by the new HOA president, a reasonable guy named Tom Richardson who lived in the Meadowbrook development. He apologized profusely for everything Patricia had put me through and assured me the HOA would be implementing better oversight going forward. "We had no idea," he said. "She ran everything like her personal fiefdom. We just assumed she knew what she was doing." The police investigation moved quickly. They executed a search warrant on Patricia's house and found detailed records of her scheme. She'd kept meticulous notes, probably thinking she'd never get caught. She'd been systematically targeting properties on the edges of the subdivision, betting that the owners wouldn't check their property records carefully. Most people, when told they owe HOA dues by an official-looking woman with a clipboard, just pay up. I'd only challenged it because I'd been so careful when I bought the property. The criminal charges were filed in April. Patricia was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and filing false liens. The case made the local news, and I got calls from several of the other property owners she'd scammed. We ended up forming a small group to share information and support each other through the legal process. One of them, a retired teacher named Helen Morrison, had been paying HOA dues for 8 years before discovering her property wasn't actually part of the subdivision. She'd paid over $12,000 for absolutely nothing. The trial was scheduled for September, but Patricia's attorney negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of 5 years in prison and full restitution to her victims. The sentencing hearing was in October, and I attended along with several other victims. We each had a chance to give impact statements. I kept mine brief, explaining how Patricia's actions had cost me thousands in legal fees and countless hours of stress. Helen Morrison was more emotional, talking about how she'd been living on a fixed income and had sometimes skipped meals to afford the HOA dues Patricia had illegally charged her. The judge sentenced Patricia to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay back every penny she'd stolen, plus additional damages. Her husband, who'd apparently had no knowledge of her crimes, filed for divorce before she was even transported to prison. The whole ordeal took nearly a year from start to finish, but it finally ended. The fraudulent lien was removed from my property. I received compensation for my legal fees, and Meadowbrook Estates HOA implemented strict new oversight procedures. I actually developed a decent relationship with the new HOA board. They invited me to a neighborhood barbecue as an apology, and while I politely declined joining the HOA officially, I did start attending some of their social events. Tom Richardson turned out to be a good guy, and we became friends. The 6 properties that had been illegally included in the HOA were formally released, and each owner received refunds for the dues they'd paid. The HOA's insurance covered most of it, though the organization took a financial hit. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, always verify property records yourself, no matter what anyone tells you. Second, document everything when dealing with disputes. Third, some people will twist facts to fit their narrative, no matter how wrong they are. But the most important lesson was this: standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and expensive, is worth it. If I just paid Patricia that first $800, I'd have been trapped in an endless cycle of illegitimate fines and fees. By challenging her immediately and following through, I not only protected myself, but helped expose a fraud that had been harming my neighbors for years. My property remained wonderfully free of HOA restrictions. I kept my truck in the driveway, my trash bins wherever I wanted them, and my fence at exactly the height I'd built it. The peace and quiet of not having Patricia Hendricks looking over my shoulder was worth every penny I'd spent on legal fees. About a year after everything was resolved, I was working in my yard when Tom Richardson stopped by. He'd become a regular visitor, often bringing his dog for walks on my property with my permission. "Hey, Ashford, got a minute?" he called out. I set down my rake and walked over. "What's up?" "I wanted to thank you again. We just finished the full audit, and it turns out Patricia had been stealing even more than we initially thought, over $150,000 total. If you hadn't challenged her, she might have kept going for years." "I just didn't want to pay for something I didn't know," I said with a shrug. "Well, your stubbornness saved a lot of people a lot of money. The insurance company is covering most of the restitution, and we're working with the court to get everyone fully compensated." Helen Morrison was able to pay off some medical bills with her refund. That made me smile. Helen had become a friend too, and I knew she'd been struggling financially. "There's something else," Tom continued. "The HOA board has been discussing it, and we want to officially recognize what you did. We're planning to name the new community park after you, the Ashford Xavier Community Gardens. What do you think?" I was genuinely touched. "You don't have to do that. We want to. It's a reminder that accountability matters and that standing up against corruption is important, even when it's hard." I agreed, and 6 months later, I attended the dedication ceremony for the community gardens. It was a beautiful space with walking paths, flower beds, and a vegetable garden that residents could tend collectively. A small plaque at the entrance explained that the gardens were named in honor of someone who'd stood up for what was right and helped expose corruption in the community. Standing there, looking at the families enjoying the space, I felt a sense of closure. What had started as a nightmare scenario, being ambushed on my own porch by an aggressive HOA president, had ended with justice being served and a community becoming stronger. I still see the irony in the whole situation. Patricia had been so convinced that my property was part of her domain that she'd never bothered to verify the basic facts. Her arrogance and greed had been her downfall. If she'd just checked the property records before confronting me, she'd have realized her mistake and none of this would have happened. But then again, the investigation might never have happened either, and she'd have continued stealing from innocent people indefinitely. Life has a funny way of working out sometimes. The woman who demanded I join her HOA and threatened me with liens and fines ended up in prison, while I ended up with new friends, a stronger sense of community, and a park named after me. My house still sits on the same 12 acres of the old Jennings farm, surrounded by oak trees and wild meadow. I never did join the HOA, and I never will. But I learned that being a good neighbor doesn't require membership in any organization. It just requires mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the willingness to stand up when those boundaries are violated on quiet mornings. I sometimes sit on my porch with my coffee and think about that first encounter with Patricia. I remember her clipboard, her certainty, her absolute conviction that she was right. I wonder if she ever thinks about it from her prison cell, if she ever regrets not taking 5 minutes to check the county records before starting a war she couldn't win. The deed to my property sits in my safe, official proof that this land is mine and mine alone. It's the same deed I showed Patricia's lawyer in court, the same deed that proved beyond any doubt that her entire case was built on a foundation of assumptions and lies. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. I wasn't part of the HOA because I'd never agreed to be part of the HOA and my property had never been part of the subdivision. No amount of bluster, threats, or fraudulent liens could change that basic fact. The legal system worked the way it was supposed to. Justice was served. The guilty were punished. The victims were compensated. And I got to keep living my life exactly the way I wanted to, free from the tyranny of an HOA president who thought rules were whatever she said they were. I still get the occasional solicitation from other organizations wanting me to join something or support some cause. I'm polite but firm in my refusals. I've learned to trust my instincts and verify everything. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA is doing well under new leadership. They've become more transparent, more accountable, and more reasonable. They stopped trying to enforce rules on people who aren't actually members, which seems like a low bar but apparently needed to be learned the hard way. As for me, I'm content. My fence is still 3 inches taller than Patricia thought it should be. My mailbox is still the wrong color according to her old guidelines. My truck still sits in my driveway whenever I want it there, and my trash bins remain visible from the street on collection days. These small freedoms, these tiny acts of independence, mean more to me now than they did before. They're reminders that I stood my ground, proved my case, and won. They're symbols of property rights, personal liberty, and the importance of knowing what you actually own versus what someone else claims you owe. The whole experience made me a better neighbor, ironically enough. I'm more aware of community issues, more willing to help when asked, and more appreciative of the people around me who respect boundaries and treat others fairly. I just do it all without paying dues to an organization I was never legally required to join. In the end, Patricia Hendricks did me a favor, though I doubt she sees it that way from her prison cell. She taught me the value of standing firm, the importance of documentation, and the power of being absolutely certain of your facts before taking action. That last lesson is one she learned too late, but it's one I'll carry with me forever. Know what you own, know what you're responsible for, and never let anyone bully you into accepting their version of reality when you have the documents to prove otherwise. My property is mine, free and clear, no HOA strings attached, and that's exactly how it's going to stay.